Step out.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Southern Draw Law. My name is James White, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, former police officer. Now, a bit of a warning about today's video. It is very likely to elicit feelings of rage as we go through this story and sort of work our way through the elements of what happened, but it's important to talk about it. It's important to look at the legal aspects of what happened, and it's important to have a good idea of how to read these situations and how they generally play out. So without further ado, let's get into it. By now, you may have seen the civil rights lawyer's coverage of this story where he discussed the killing of a 23-year-old United States Airman, Roger Fortson, by the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Department in Florida, otherwise known as Airman Patrol. That's right. As you might remember, the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Department is the same department where Deputy Jesse Hernandez shot at a person helplessly detained in the back of his patrol car after an acorn hit the top of his cruiser back in November. And at that time, according to him, he thought he had been shot by the same person who was in the back of the car, who had also been searched no less than 3 times.
Shots fired! Shots fired! Shots fired! Shots fired!
This time we have an as yet unidentified deputy who has been called to a possible disturbance at an apartment building with very few details. There's conflicting information about who heard what. There's no victim complaining. All we have here are reports of what has been described as essentially a verbal altercation. So the deputy ends up going to Mr. Fortson's apartment based on what the apartment employees and the complainants on the scene tell him, and he begins aggressively beating on the door and demanding that the person open up. News 4 Jax probably had the best summary video of the important parts of this case, so let's watch their video and then we'll come back and talk about some of it.
Was the killing of a U.S. airman justifiable, or did law enforcement cross the line and overreact with the use of deadly force? It's a question FDLE investigators are now working to answer. Sheriff's deputies gunned down the man in his own home. He answered the door with a gun in his hand, a gun that was pointed toward the floor. And we do want to warn you, the video you're about to see may be disturbing.
Sheriff's office, open the door! Step out. Drop the gun! Drop the gun!
It's the moment Senior Airman Roger Fortson was shot 6 times in his hallway. The entire confrontation lasting less than 3 seconds after Okaloosa County Sheriff's deputies received this call about a physical disturbance in progress at the apartment complex.
Don't have any further other than a male and female. It's all fourth-party information through the front desk at the leasing office.
Roger Fortson was the best America had to offer. He was a U.S. Airman, Special Ops.
Civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump says the Okaloosa County deputy knocked on the wrong door because Fortson had been home alone and on FaceTime with his girlfriend at the time of the shooting.
Drop the gun!
He's over there.
Drop the gun!
I don't have it.
312, shots fired. Suspect down.
So as has been widely reported, Fortson answers the door holding a gun, possibly because he had just heard aggressive pounding on the door. We later learned that Roger Fortson was alone in the apartment at the time, so there was no disturbance involving him at least. And he was on the phone participating in a FaceTime call with his girlfriend at the time. But how did we get here to begin with? So let's dive a little deeper into the details of the call. The deputy is responding to a reported disturbance call. On the way, he's advised by dispatch, as you just saw in that video, that this is fourth-party information. That matters. That means not only was no one directly involved, we don't even have a person with direct knowledge even. That would be third-party information. No, this is like that scene from the movie Friday where Ice Cube's character Craig is accused of going to a show based on his girlfriend being told by her sister-in-law's baby cousin Tracy that she went to the show and saw Craig all hugged up with a tramp. So we have the equivalent of a disturbance report from someone's sister-in-law's baby cousin Tracy that ends a person's life. As ridiculous as that sounds. Now, the employees that were interviewed by the officer prior to him knocking on the door say that they weren't sure about what was going on. They didn't witness any fight. The deputy then meets with a complaining witness who is yet unidentified, but who claims to have walked by the apartment building a couple weeks earlier and heard a disturbance and didn't call the police because she wasn't sure where it was coming from. And she's apparently had a conversation on this day with somebody who's told her from a neighboring apartment that she believes that the disturbance is coming from Roger's apartment. So based on her statement and her suggestion that it was happening at 1401, this deputy goes to Roger Fortson's apartment. Now, preliminarily, I'll suggest to you that we have a serious leadership problem at the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Department in Sheriff Eric Aden. If the last two shootings are not evidence enough of that, watch his statement at the press conference here, and then I'll hit you with some further statistics, and we'll see where you land after that.
Good afternoon. I'm Eric Aden. I'm the Sheriff of Okaloosa County with the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office. A few moments ago, I personally met with Mrs. Fortson and the Fortson family, extended my deepest condolences to them, and this result is one we never hoped to encounter, and I'm also thinking about our team here and the deputy involved in the tragic event.
So if you pay close attention to people say and how they say them, you can tell where they stand on the issues they're discussing without them saying the actual words. Sheriff Aden starts off with the obligatory yet hollow condolences to the Fortson family. And then he says he's also thinking about the deputy involved in this tragic event. He means the deputy that we just all witnessed commit murder while wearing his agency's badge, but what he's really trying to imply is that there are two victims here. The deputy who had no choice but to shoot Mr. Fortson and obviously Mr. Fortson.
I'm here this afternoon to further assure Ms. Fortson's family, our dedicated team and community we serve, and the broader public that we are doing what we can to ensure the facts of this case are fully understood. To that end, I've asked the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to handle the criminal investigation that is required under these circumstances. It is important to note that while this is a criminal investigation, no determination has been made as to whether the deputy's actions were justified or not. Here in Okaloosa County, we pride ourselves in our commitment to transparency and accountability. These investigations take time, but I want to assure you that we are not hiding, covering up, or taking action that would result in a rush to judgment of Mr. Fortson or our deputy. While it might be difficult to see, there are many questions the investigation must answer before we can determine whether the officer's actions were justified. Again, we are committed to the transparency and look forward to FDLE and the state attorney's report. We are aware of a press release and other comments that falsely state our deputy entered the wrong apartment and imply that they burst through the door into Mr. Fortson's residence. Those statements are inaccurate, as shown on the video that we are about to see.
He then goes on to give himself credit for inviting the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to investigate, which he also acknowledges simultaneously is required by law. And then he essentially begins to attack what he calls a false narrative, and he takes a defensive posture about the insinuation that the deputy was responding to the wrong apartment and bursted through the door. This was something that was, I think, put out by Benjamin Crump, who's a civil rights lawyer who is in conjunction with some Florida law firm to represent the family. He's basically the media mouthpiece because, let's be honest, he's one of the most famous civil rights lawyers that there are in the country. He's essentially the new Jesse Jackson, the new Al Sharpton. He's the one that when he talks, people listen. Let's have a sidebar real quick. Is that actually a false narrative? Let's see what was actually said. Benjamin Crump insinuated that the deputy went to the wrong apartment. Now, it's true that the deputy responded to apartment 1401, but he only did that based on being told some information by some person who didn't have any firsthand knowledge, and she admitted as much. So in that way, I guess he was going to the apartment that he was told to go to, but does that make it the right apartment? The answer is clearly no. Is it not also true that once all this played out, it was determined that Roger Fortson was the only person there? Yes, that is true, which means it's not possible that there could have been a disturbance with another person inside the home because he was there alone. So we can all agree that to the extent there was a disturbance justifying an investigation, it most certainly was not in apartment 1401, so it was, in fact, the wrong apartment if there was even a right apartment. Now, once the deputy beat on the door and demanded that Mr. Fortson step out or step back, he did, in fact, burst into the apartment unwelcomed and without a warrant. He just happened to do it after he unloaded 5 rounds into Roger Fortson, leaving him gasping for his last breath while his girlfriend listened to him die. So That statement by Benjamin Crump was also true.
What we do know at this time is that the deputy did announce himself, not once, but twice. Mr. Fortson's comments indicate that he did acknowledge it was law enforcement at the door, and he arrived at the door with a firearm in his hand. The deputy knocked on the correct door. He did not cover the peephole or otherwise obscure its view in any way.
Sheriff Aiden next characterizes Fortson's comments as him acknowledging it was law enforcement at the door. Well, that's not true either. We now know that Fortson was on a FaceTime call with his girlfriend when this took place. If you actually watch the video, you'll probably come to the same conclusion that I came to, which was that his comments seemed to indicate to me that he was expressing to his girlfriend that he didn't know what was going on, and it's possible that he thought there might be police outside. Did that mean that he acknowledged they were there for him? Absolutely not. Do we think it's possible that Roger Fortson heard the same disturbance that the callers heard, but was choosing to mind his business and talk to his girlfriend instead of getting involved? And following along with the logic of that possibility, isn't it also possible that when he heard police outside, he thought they were responding to the disturbance and had no idea they were addressing him, or that he'd been accused of being involved with the disturbance? Maybe that's the reason he walked to the door with a gun, because he didn't know what kind of threat was on the other side of the door. Or maybe he intended to open the door to see what was going on and was arming himself so he could help the police. He was in active service to our country as a member of the Air Force, by the way. Well, that's way too logical of a path for cops to follow who have an interest in justifying what they just did. And all it takes to know that's what they're trying to do is a little attention to detail. If you go back to the original edited body cam footage released at the press conference by Sheriff Aiden, you'll notice that before being released to the media, it has text captions. You know that because if you watch as the VLC media player starts to show the file, the title to the file has the words blurred and subtitled. Now, Sheriff Aiden, in his composition of these subtitles, was sure to sandwich the word police between two captions labeled inaudible, as it was showing what was allegedly heard by the deputy in response to his knocks on the door. So you have ostensibly Mr. Fortson inaudible, police inaudible. Now, they admit they have absolutely no idea what the context was of his statement, but they want to make sure that they can pick the word police out of the middle of that slop sandwich, and so they go ahead and tell you everything that they need you to know about this situation so that we all come away believing that Roger Fortson came to the door armed and ready to confront a police officer that he knew was there for him, and by the way, was responding to a disturbance that he wasn't involved with in any way whatsoever. So here's what I think actually happened. You remember that the deputy initially said step back or step out, one or the other. I can't tell. It sounded to me like he said step out, but the caption said step back. So either way, he's giving a command to Fortson. Fortson does have a gun, but not only is he holding it at his side, his body, at least as it appears in the body camera, looks to me to be bladed in a way that makes it look like the gun is sort of tucked toward the back of or behind his leg. Now, as a firearm instructor and enthusiast, I recognize this as a way that I might hold a gun in order to keep it tucked behind me such that it wouldn't be out to be grabbed by someone who might be at the door, but still be available exclusively to me if I needed it. It's a way to be able to keep the gun away from the reach of whatever's outside, but still be able to sort of slice the pie or create tactical angles through the threshold of the door to see what's outside the doorway in small pie-like slices or sections at a time before I commit to going outside. I'm keeping the gun back, my hand forward, my ability to see without involving the gun into whatever I might encounter as I go out the door. Most significantly, this is a non-threatening way of answering the door. So based on the deputy's reaction, it appears that he initially sees Roger but not the gun. And so he orders him to step out or step back, whichever one you believe happened. Then he sees the gun and then he freaks out. He shoots first and then he gives the command to drop the gun, which you can hear Roger essentially dying, saying, "I don't have it. It's over there." Now, in my opinion, as we walk through whether or not this would be a lawful detention, there was no reasonable articulable suspicion to justify a seizure at that point. So both the initial order demanding that he come to the door after the aggressive pounding on the door, as well as the order to step back or step out, was unlawful, in my opinion. The United States Supreme Court case of Florida versus JL stands for the proposition that calls alone are not enough for a detention based on reasonable articulable suspicion. And it's also well established that reasonable articulable suspicion is based off the facts known to the officer at the time of the incident. Well, what are those facts? Fourth-hand information, completely unsubstantiated, justifying at most a knock and talk to figure out what was going on. That's it. Now, you can glean some insight as to how the Florida Department of Law Enforcement might handle this by looking at some of their previous press releases, and I've attached a couple of those to the description, as well as looking at the Okaloosa County's press release related to the Acorn incident, where they walk through Jesse Hernandez's response and their analysis of deadly force and justification. In it, they cite Florida Department of Law Enforcement's standard as it relates to the use of deadly force. The report says that deadly force shall only be used when the officer reasonably believes that the action is in defense of human life, including the officer's own life, or in defense of any person in imminent danger of serious physical injury. Now, this is judged based on the Graham factor's use of a reasonable officer in the same situation as the standard. Obviously, a brief look over the Graham factors, which John Bryan did a better job of, so I won't go into it in detail, but they definitely favor Mr. Fortson here. You have the severity of the crime as the first factor. Well, there wasn't one. There was no justification for a detention or an arrest, and no use of force was authorized at all or justified. The second would be the threat to the officer. Well, maybe the presence of the gun, but I'd say minimal at best, because instead of drawing the gun, the video actually shows, as it's paused by the AP's video, Mr. Fortson sticking out his forward hand to cover his chest just before he's shot. So it's unclear whether he's saying, hey, wait a minute, man, or whether he actually is trying to block the rounds or what, but he is sticking his hand out. He's not drawing the gun. And then the third factor would be whether there's a fleeing suspect, and of course there's not. The man was killed standing in his own doorway. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement further defines deadly resistance by a suspect as a suspect's hostile or attacking movements with or without a weapon that create a reasonable perception by the law enforcement officer that the subject has the capability and intent to cause death or great bodily harm to the law enforcement officer or others. Anytime you see the word "and," that's a conjunctive test, which means you have to have both of those. So in this case, you have to have the capability and the intent to cause death or great bodily harm to the law enforcement officer or others. You might have the capability because he's holding a gun. I don't think that's disputable, but you clearly have no intent whatsoever here. So in my opinion, this deputy has none of the protections normally afforded to a law enforcement officer in making an arrest or a seizure or having to use force in effecting that arrest or seizure. He's stuck with what would be considered an imperfect self-defense claim if he were just a regular citizen. As such, if we take a look at Florida's manslaughter code, I believe that's what he will eventually be charged with for a negligent and disproportionate response under the circumstances. The manslaughter statute reads as follows: the killing of a human being by the act, procurement, or culpable negligence of another without lawful justification, and in cases in which such killing shall not be excusable homicide or murder, is manslaughter, a felony of the second degree. And if you look at the code for the second degree felony punishment, that would be up to 15 years in prison. That, I think, fits this situation pretty closely, and that's what I predict will actually happen. My closing argument is intended to shine a light on the mismanagement of this agency in the time that Eric Aiden has been sworn in as the sheriff. In the 3 years and 4 months that Aiden has been the Okaloosa County Sheriff, based on their own press release archives, the department has had 8 officer-involved shootings. While on their faces, at least 6 of them appear to be reasonably related, at least, to threats and armed criminal suspects. But at least the last 2 have been wholly unjustified, in my opinion. Mr. Jackson barely escaped with his life back in November of 2023 during the Acorn terror attack. Mr. Fortson was not as lucky. Now you might say, but James, Okaloosa County is a wild place. It's Destin and Fort Walton Beach, and everybody goes there for spring break, and there's all the goings on, and surely this is a fairly common thing, right? Well, this county does have its fair share of crazy stuff happening. People falling off of balconies and dying, drowning because of people being in the water, all kinds of stuff. It's definitely an active place. But I did a little digging into this department's officer-involved shootings over the period where they actually have archives on their website. So I looked through the archives all the way back to 2012. For the previous sheriff, Larry Ashley, He had 3 officer-involved shootings in the 4 years prior to Eric Aden taking office. In Ashley's term before that, he had 3 officer-involved shootings in that 4-year period. In fact, if you go all the way back to all the archives listed until 2012, there are only 6 officer-involved shootings in the 3 administrations prior to Eric Aden. So again, in the 3 years and 4 months as sheriff, Eric Aden's 8 officer-involved shootings is 2 more than the previous 3 administrations combined. So, do we have a leadership problem? Are the Okaloosa County deputies feeling empowered to shoot first and ask questions later? You make up your own mind. Now, my audience is small. John Bryan covered this case. He's probably got 500,000 views on his video by now, as has every major news outlet, and the family has hired Benjamin Crump. And that is the only reason that if justice is done, that it will happen. It's an election year, and maybe, just maybe, there will be a change in leadership. Unfortunately, though, that change will be too late for Airman Roger Fortson. That's all for this one, guys. The heart's a little heavy after looking into the facts of this case and kind of gathering all the information, but I appreciate you sticking through it with me and listening to my rant. Please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment. Let me know what you think of this case. Please refrain from making any comments that suggest that someone should be murdered or any violent action taken towards anyone. Check out the other videos on my channel and leave me a comment on them as well. Until I see you again, take care. Always film your interactions with the police and keep your evidence to yourself.